All right, buckle up, because if there's one thing global power dynamics are not, it's simple.
Definitely not. They're rarely these neat, fixed alliances or, clear-cut rivalries.
Exactly. And what's really insightful here is how some of the most crucial relationships, they just defy easy labels, right? It forces this kind of diplomatic ballet.
Where weaknesses can almost become strengths, ironically.
Yeah. So today we're diving deep into one of the most complex, high-stakes geopolitical triangles on the planet. The interwoven relationship between Russia, India, and China.
It's incredibly fluid, isn't it? A really multifaceted dynamic.
It is, shaped by, well, everything. History, economics, security, strategic interests, all tangled together.
Absolutely.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack how mutual need, deep mistrust, and these constantly shifting global power equations define this crucial, ever-changing dynamic.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Where should we start? Maybe the history.
Yeah, that history is foundational, I think.
Yeah.
If we look back after the Cold War, Russia found itself needing to rebuild its global influence.
Right. The Soviet Union had collapsed.
Precisely. And Moscow actively sought to counter what was then seen as a unipolar U.S.-led world order. Basically, the U.S. as the sole superpower.
So they needed partners.
They did. And to do this, Moscow pushed for a trilateral cooperation model. You might have heard of it, the Primakov Doctrine.
Ah, yes. The idea of Russia, India, China working together.
That was the core idea. A blueprint to foster a strong partnership, create a new balance of power. And, initially this concept found some appeal.
When was this, roughly?
Mostly in the early 2000s. All three countries shared a certain dissatisfaction with that U.S.-dominated global landscape.
Makes sense. But it didn't quite pan out that way, did it?
No, the gap between the theory and, the practice widened considerably over time.
Why was that?
Well, a key reason was the intensifying rivalry between India and China themselves. That became a major obstacle.
The border issues and strategic competition heating up?
Exactly. And on top of that, Russia's dependency on China deepened significantly, especially after Western sanctions hit Moscow hard.
Post-Crimea, and then escalating massively after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Right. And that dependency really weakened the practical idea of a unified, balanced Russia-India-China bloc. The power dynamics within the potential triangle shifted.
So that historical stage was definitely set, but then, like you said, the war in Ukraine, that was a real earthquake, wasn't it? It just dramatically reshaped this entire geopolitical landscape.
It really did, pushing Moscow almost irrevocably eastward.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because the concrete evidence of this no-limits partnership, as they called it, between Russia and China, it's pretty stark.
The numbers speak for themselves.
Yeah. Trade between Russia and China, for example, crossed a historic $240 billion in 2024 alone. That's just staggering.
It is a massive figure.
What specific sectors are driving that kind of growth, and what's making this partnership so robust beyond just, the raw trade figures?
Well, a huge chunk of that surge is driven by Russia's energy exports to China, often at discounted prices, we should add.
A captive market, essentially, after Europe cut back.
Pretty much. And then going the other way, China is providing dual-use technologies.
Ah, the sensitive stuff. Things with both civilian and military applications.
Exactly. Advanced components, certain AI systems, drone parts, things like that. It makes their transfer particularly strategic.
And it's not just goods, is it?
No, we also see massive infrastructure projects linking them and significant military cooperation. Think joint naval drills in the Indo-Pacific, even up in the Arctic.
Which raises eyebrows in Washington and Tokyo, for sure.
Absolutely. And it's also worth noting China's careful diplomatic stance. Beijing has, refused to outright condemn the invasion of Ukraine.
While providing crucial diplomatic and economic cover.
Right. And this partnership is expanding, too.
Yeah.
Across energy, banking, trying to find alternatives to Western systems and multilateral platforms like BRICS and the SKO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization.
Okay, so on one hand, we see Russia leaning heavily into China, driven largely by necessity, by sanctions. But what's fascinating here is Russia's simultaneous effort to maintain strong ties with India. It seems almost contradictory on the surface.
It does look that way.
Do you think Moscow genuinely believes India can be a strong enough counterweight to China's influence? Or is this maybe more of a desperate hope given their current isolation from the West?
It's definitely a tightrope walk, no question. Despite its growing closeness to Beijing, Russia still sees India as a vital partner for precisely that reason you mentioned.
To balance China.
To balance China's potential overreach, exactly. And to preserve what they call multipolarity in Eurasia, a world with multiple power centers, not just Washington and Beijing, or even just Beijing dominating the region.
And we see concrete examples of this continued cooperation.
Oh, absolutely. We see this in their ongoing cooperation. Russia continues to supply critical military hardware to India. The big one is the S-400 missile system.
Right, the advanced air defense system. That caused some friction with the U.S., didn't it?
It did under CAATSA. But India went ahead. They also jointly manufacture AK-203 rifles in India now, and they work together on projects like the BrahMos missile.
One of the world's fastest cruise missiles.
Correct. And also that ambitious Chennai-Vladivostok maritime corridor idea.
Trying to link India's east coast with Russia's far east.
Exactly. However, this relationship isn't easy for Russia to manage. India's own strategic calculus is shifting.
How so?
Well, India's growing alignment with the West, particularly through the Quad alliance, with the U.S., Japan, and Australia, that obviously complicates things for Moscow.
Seeing India get closer to the U.S. camp.
And India's deepening defense cooperation directly with the United States is a factor, too. Plus, India's own push, a very strong push to indigenize defense production, to make more weapons at home.
Make it India.
That's the one. And then there are concerns in India about delays and, frankly, overdependence on Russian arms suppliers, especially given Russia's focus on its own war effort. All this has pushed India to diversify its defense procurement away from just Russia.
So Russia's trying to keep India close, but India's keeping its options open and looking westward, too. A complex dance indeed.
Very much so.
Now that's Russia's complex balancing act, but let's shift focus. What about China and India, the other 2 points of this triangle? Their relationship is arguably even more fraught, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. China's approach to India is, well, it's a blend of intense competition and, you could say, cautious, almost performative diplomacy.
Performative, I like that. How do you mean?
Well, on one hand, you have robust bilateral trade. It's huge. Chinese electronics, machinery, they form a massive part of India's imports.
So economically intertwined to a degree.
To a significant degree. But that economic link doesn't erase the deep sources of strain. Not at all.
The border, obviously.
The border is the most obvious, yes. The unresolved disputes, particularly after those violent clashes in the Galwan Valley back in 2020, that was a major turning point.
Yeah, lives were lost on both sides. Trust evaporated.
Completely. And for New Delhi, there are other strategic alarm bells ringing constantly. Think about China's very strong, all-weather relationship with Pakistan. That's always a major concern for India.
China backing India's main rival.
Right. And China's support, sometimes subtle, sometimes not, for anti-India positions in international forums. And then there are its growing ambitions in the Indian Ocean region.
The string of pearls theory, China investing in ports around India.
Exactly. Investments in places like Gwadar in Pakistan or Hambantota in Sri Lanka. India definitely views this as a potential encirclement strategy.
So deep mistrust there. Which brings us back to those multilateral groups like BRICS and ESCO. This raises an important question about the true nature of their engagement there, doesn't it?
It really does.
So it's almost like a performative unity you mentioned. They talk about global South solidarity, developing nations sticking together.
Unity against perceived Western dominance, often.
But behind the scenes, it's still pretty much cutthroat geopolitics.
That seems to be the case. It certainly creates tension. There's this apparent contradiction. China shares these platforms, BRICS, ESCO, with India. Within these groups, it often calls for unity among the global South.
Presents a common front.
Yet, at the same time, evidence suggests it actively tries to limit India's influence within these very same groups.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, there was a recent instance where India refused to sign an ESCO joint statement. The reason cited was that the statement didn't adequately condemn a terrorist attack affecting Indian citizens.
Implying China, maybe with Pakistan's influence, blocked stronger language.
That was the strong implication, yes, hinting at behind-the-scenes coordination between China and Pakistan. So it shows this clear tension between the declared solidarity on stage and the underlying strategic competition backstage.
Does this kind of backroom maneuvering seriously undermine the credibility of these organizations for India, do you think?
It must raise questions in New Delhi about the real value versus the potential constraints of participating so actively.
So, given all this complexity, Russia leaning on China, China competing fiercely with India, multilateral stages being used for shadowboxing, How does India navigate this? It seems incredibly difficult.
It boils down to its core foreign policy principle, strategic autonomy.
Duh, the famous balancing act.
Exactly. This isn't just about refusing to pick sides like in the old non-aligned movement sense. It's more active. It's a high-stakes bet, really.
A bet on what?
A bet that by keeping everyone guessing, by engaging with all sides, India maximizes its own leverage on the global stage. It avoids being locked into any single camp.
So India isn't fully aligning with anyone. It maintains active engagement with, well, all three major global power centers, the West, Russia, and China, despite the tensions.
Precisely. And you can see this illustrated quite clearly. India's strong defense and, as we'll discuss, energy ties with Russia exist right alongside its significant growing collaboration with the United States.
On things like maritime security in the Indo-Pacific, intelligence sharing, critical and emerging technologies.
Correct. And India is also an active member of BRICS and the SKO, engaging with Russia and China there. But, and this is key, it's simultaneously pushing for its own alternative connectivity projects.
Right, not just relying on China's Belt and Road Initiative.
Definitely not. Things like the International North-South Transport Corridor, the INSTC, going through Iran and Central Asia. That helps India reduce its dependency on China-dominated routes and, truly carve its own path, build its own influence.
It's about creating options, isn't it?
It's all about options and flexibility.
Yeah.
And energy has definitely become another major arena of this strategic competition and balancing.
Yeah, let's talk about energy. That shift in India's oil imports was dramatic.
Absolutely striking. We've seen India's imports of Russian crude oil jump from just about 1% back in, say, 2017 to almost 30% in 2024.
30%, mostly because of the discounts Russia offered after Western sanctions kicked in.
That's the main driver, yes. Deep discounts made it economically irresistible for India.
So on the one hand, this strengthens India's energy security, keeps fuel prices relatively stable domestically, and of course, shores up the relationship with Moscow.
All true. But it comes at a cost, or at least a risk. It draws significant criticism from the U.S. and Europe.
With threats of secondary sanctions or tariffs?
There have certainly been explicit threats and a lot of diplomatic pressure behind the scenes. So India may soon face, or perhaps is already facing, some tough choices between that cheap Russian energy and potential Western pressure.
Another tightrope.
Indeed. And beyond energy, this geopolitical game is also unfolding rapidly in technology and infrastructure. It's another critical front.
How so?
Well, you see India and Russia exploring cooperation in areas like artificial intelligence, space exploration, cybersecurity, even rare earth minerals, which are vital for tech.
Trying to maintain that traditional partnership in new domains.
Exactly. But at the very same time, India is aggressively building high-tech partnerships with the U.S., the EU, and Japan. Why? Primarily to counter China's dominance in critical areas like semiconductors and green technology.
Playing both sides again, leveraging competition.
Precisely. Meanwhile, you have Russia and China working together on things like the digital yuan and alternative banking systems. They're trying to challenge the dollar-based financial system, bypass SWIFT, that sort of thing.
A move to de-dollarize, or at least create alternatives. How does India view that?
India watches this very cautiously. It understands the desire to reduce reliance on the dollar, but is not yet fully supporting or joining these specific Russia-China initiatives. It benefits from the current system, too.
Still hedging its bets. And you mentioned connectivity projects earlier. How else is India using infrastructure strategically?
Right. So to further solidify its presence across Eurasia, and again, reduce reliance on Chinese infrastructure, India is really pushing these transport corridors.
Like the INSTC we mentioned.
Yes, and also reviving interest in that Chennai-Vladivostok maritime route. It was once seen as largely symbolic, but now it's gaining renewed importance as an alternative east-west corridor, bypassing the usual choke points.
Connecting directly to Russia's Pacific coast.
Exactly. And similarly, India is revitalizing its investments in the Chabahar port in Iran. The goal is to connect Chabahar to Central Asia and ultimately Russia through new rail and road networks.
Bypassing Pakistan and offering an alternative to China's projects there.
That's the strategic aim. These projects are designed to challenge China's growing control over key Eurasian routes and provide India with a more independent logistical base across the region.
It's a truly intricate balancing act. I mean, the metaphor you use, the tightrope walk, seems apt. Or maybe juggling 3 flaming torches while riding a unicycle.
That captures the complexity, yes.
So as we've sort of untangled this complex web, we have to ask, what are the real perils? What are the risks lurking in this strategic dance for India especially?
Well, the central dilemma for India, as we've discussed, is that it finds itself balancing between two major powers, Russia and China, that are, for their own reasons, drawing increasingly closer to each other.
A tough spot to be in.
Definitely. Now, both Russia and China have their motivations for managing this dynamic carefully with India. Russia, as we said, wants to maintain India as a significant partner, avoid complete dependence on China.
Keep some leverage.
Right. And China, for its part, probably wants to avoid pushing India too far or too fast into the arms of the West. A neutral, or at least non-hostile India is better than a fully aligned one.
And India, of course, uses this dynamic, this slight tension between its two neighbors to maximize its own strategic flexibility.
Absolutely. And to project itself as a rising global power that cannot be, boxed into any single bloc. It insists on its autonomy.
But the risks must be significant. So what does this all mean for India's future path?
The path forward is indeed precarious. You can point to specific risks quite clearly.
Like what?
Okay, first, if that China-Russia partnership, which seems mostly tactical or convenience-based for now, if it actually hardens into a more permanent ideological anti-Western bloc.
A real Eurasian alliance against the U.S. and its allies.
If that happens, India's room to maneuver, its ability to play both sides, could shrink dramatically. It would be much harder to maintain that equidistant posture.
Okay, that's a big one. What else?
Second, energy. If the West eventually decides to take a much harder line against Russian oil imports, maybe through more aggressive secondary sanctions or price cap enforcement.
India might be forced to choose between cheap energy and its Western relationship.
Exactly. It would force a very difficult reconsideration of its current energy strategy. That could have major economic and political consequences domestically.
And the third major risk?
The border with China. Crucially, if tensions flare up again significantly, if there's another major clash like Galwan.
New Delhi would be under immense pressure to react strongly.
Immense pressure. And that would force a fundamental recalibration of its diplomacy, not just with China, but across all of Eurasia, including its relationship with Russia. Could Moscow stay neutral? Would it tacitly back China? Big questions.
It really is a high-wire act, isn't it? With potentially huge global ramifications depending on how India navigates these risks.
Absolutely. It's not just regional. It impacts the global balance.
Wow. What a deep dive this has been. I think the core takeaway is crystal clear, though. The geopolitical game between Russia, India, and China, it's not a rigid alliance. It's not a simple rivalry.
No, it's much more fluid.
It really is that strategic dance, as we called it, a dance of hedging, balancing, and very careful engagement.
Well put.
And each player has a distinct role in this dance, doesn't it? You have Russia sort of playing both sides to try and escape isolation and retain influence.
Maximizing its limited options.
Then there's China, consolidating its power, aiming for regional dominance, while bracing for long-term competition with both the U.S. and increasingly India.
Seeing India as a potential challenger down the road.
And then there's India, walking that fine line between East and West, fiercely defending its strategic autonomy, building these new corridors, and actively trying to avoid entanglement in any major power block war.
Carving out its own space as a leading power.
So for you, listening to this, understanding these nuanced, constantly shifting dynamics in global power is absolutely critical. I mean, it shapes everything from energy prices to trade routes to security alliances.
It really underpins so much of what's happening globally. And maybe as you think about this further, consider this provocative thought.
Okay.
While this triangle, Russia, India, China, may not form a truly unified front or a coherent bloc, it's shifting internal dynamics, the push and pull between them, that will undoubtedly shape the future of Eurasian power politics and therefore global stability for decades to come.
So even without a formal alliance, their interactions are key.
Absolutely key. And it's worth considering how interconnected global events that might seem unrelated, like a specific energy policy decision or another border dispute, or even a sudden technological breakthrough, how quickly those could shift this delicate balance in really unforeseen ways.
Demanding constant recalculation from all three powers.
Constant recalculation. It's a dynamic system, always in flux.